The scream that tore through the Montana night in 1876 was the kind that made even hardened men stop in their tracks, and Quincy Isaacson would hear it echoing in his nightmares for weeks to come. He had been riding past the homestead on his way back to the ranch when he saw the flames reaching toward the black sky like demon fingers, clawing at the stars themselves. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward, the animal's hooves thundering against the packed earth as smoke billowed thick and acrid across the prairie. By the time he reached the burning house, the roof was already collapsing inward with a sound like thunder, sparks shooting upward in a terrible display of nature's cruelty. He kicked down what remained of the front door and plunged into the inferno, his arm raised to shield his face from the blistering heat. Through the smoke he saw her, a young woman collapsed near the back wall, her dress singed and her dark hair tangled with ash. He grabbed her under the arms and dragged her backward, his lungs screaming for air as flames licked at his boots, and the world narrowed to nothing but heat and desperation. They burst through the doorway just as a beam crashed down where they had been moments before, and he carried her clear of the house before laying her gently on the grass and collapsing beside her, coughing so hard he thought his ribs might crack. She was unconscious but breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. In the firelight he could see the damage the flames had done. The angry red burns that covered the left side of her face and neck, the blistered skin already beginning to weep. He pulled off his jacket and pressed it gently against the worst of the burns, knowing it was inadequate but not knowing what else to do. Behind them the house continued to burn, the fire consuming everything she had owned, everything she had known. He stayed with her through the night, keeping watch as the flames eventually died down to glowing embers, and the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet his, the first thing she did was reach up to touch her face. Her fingers found the damaged skin, and she let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, tears streaming down her cheeks and mixing with the ash that covered her. "Do not move too quickly," Quincy said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "You are safe now. The fire is out." She stared at him with wide, terrified eyes, one of them surrounded by angry burns. "My parents," she whispered. "My mother and father. Where are they?" He shook his head slowly, and the look of understanding that crossed her face was worse than any scream. She tried to sit up and he helped her, supporting her weight as she turned to look at the smoldering ruins of what had been her home. There was nothing left but blackened timbers and ash, and somewhere in that wreckage were the bodies of the people who had raised her. She made no sound as she wept, her shoulders shaking silently, and Quincy felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the smoke he had inhaled. He had seen death before, had lived through the war that had torn the nation apart just over a decade ago, but there was something about this young woman's grief that cut deeper than any bullet ever had. "What is your name?" he asked gently, after she had cried herself into exhaustion. "Penelope," she said, her voice barely audible. "Penelope Rutherford. This was my family's homestead. We have been here for 3 years trying to make a life for ourselves." She touched her face again, wincing at the pain. "What have I become? What will I do now?" "You have become a survivor," Quincy said firmly. "And right now, you are coming with me. I work at the Broken Arrow Ranch about 5 miles from here. The owner, Thomas Garrett, is a good man. He will give you shelter while you heal and figure out what comes next." She looked at him with those pain-filled eyes, and he saw a depth of suffering there that made his heart ache. "Why did you save me? Why did you risk your life for someone you do not even know?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because no one deserves to die alone in the dark." He helped her onto his horse, climbing up behind her to keep her steady as they made the slow journey to the ranch. The sun was fully up by the time they arrived, and Thomas Garrett came out of the main house with his wife Martha, both of them taking in the scene with grave expressions. Quincy explained what had happened while Martha immediately took charge of Penelope, leading her inside with gentle hands and soothing words. Thomas clapped Quincy on the shoulder, his weathered face creased with concern. "You did good, son," he said. "Real good. She can stay here as long as she needs. Martha will tend to those burns, though I will not lie to you, they look bad. Real bad." Quincy nodded, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up with him. He had not slept in over 24 hours and every muscle in his body ached. But as he headed to the bunkhouse to clean up and rest, his thoughts kept returning to Penelope Rutherford and the devastation he had seen in her eyes. He wondered if she would ever recover from losing everything in a single night, if the physical scars would heal even as the emotional ones remained raw and open. Over the next few weeks, Quincy found himself thinking about Penelope more than he should have. He was a cowboy, a man who spent his days herding cattle and mending fences, breaking wild horses and sleeping under the stars. He had no business being distracted by a woman he barely knew, especially one who was recovering from such terrible trauma. But he could not help himself. Every evening when he returned from the range, he would ask Martha how Penelope was doing, and every evening Martha would give him the same concerned look before reporting on her progress. The burns were healing slowly, Martha said, but the scarring would be permanent. The left side of Penelope's face would forever bear the marks of the fire. The skin pulled tight and discolored, her ear partially damaged, her hairline uneven where the flames had burned away part of her scalp. "She will not leave her room," Martha confided one evening about 2 weeks after the fire. "She takes her meals in there and refuses to see anyone except me. I think she is ashamed of how she looks now." "Can I see her?" Quincy asked before he could stop himself. Martha studied him for a long moment. "Why would you want to? Most men would not be interested in a woman who has been so marked by tragedy." "I am not most men," Quincy said quietly, "and I would like to see for myself that she is recovering. I pulled her out of that fire. I suppose I feel responsible for what happens to her now." Martha's expression softened. "You have a good heart, Quincy Isaacson. All right, I will ask her if she will see you, but do not be surprised if she says no." To his surprise, Penelope agreed to see him. Martha led him to the small guest room where Penelope had been staying, knocking softly before opening the door. Penelope was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the Montana landscape with a blank expression. She wore a simple dress that Martha had given her, and her hair had been brushed and pulled back from her face. When she turned to look at him, Quincy felt his breath catch in his throat. The burns covered the left side of her face from her temple down to her jaw, the skin mottled red and pink and white where it was healing. Her left ear was partially melted, and her eye on that side drooped slightly from the damaged tissue. But despite all of that, despite the visible evidence of her suffering, Quincy found himself looking at her and seeing something else entirely. "Hello, Mr. Isaacson," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Martha told me you wanted to see me. I suppose you want to check on your rescue, make sure your heroic efforts were not wasted on someone too ugly to be worth saving." Her words were bitter, laced with self-loathing, and Quincy felt anger flare in his chest, not at her, but at whatever had made her believe such things about herself. He crossed the room and pulled up another chair, sitting down so they were at eye level. "That is not why I am here," he said firmly. "And you are not ugly," she laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Do not lie to me, Mr. Isaacson. I have seen my reflection. I know what I look like now." I am a monster, a thing that will frighten children and make grown men look away in disgust." "You are not a monster," Quincy said, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. "You are a woman who survived something terrible. Those scars do not define you, Penelope. They are just marks on your skin, nothing more." "Nothing more." She turned away from him, her hands clenched in her lap. "They are everything now. They are all anyone will ever see when they look at me. No man will ever want me. No one will ever see past this ruined face to whatever might lie beneath." Quincy reached out and gently turned her face back toward him, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle on her chin. She flinched at first but did not pull away, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been fear. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in every detail of her face, both scarred and unscarred. He saw the delicate curve of her right cheekbone, the deep brown of her eyes, the fullness of her lips. He saw the intelligence in her gaze, the strength that had allowed her to survive losing everything, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide behind walls of bitterness and pain. "I see only beauty," he said quietly, and he meant every word. For a long moment she just stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or pity. Finding none, her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, tracing paths through the scarred tissue on one side and smooth skin on the other. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of emotions she had been holding back for weeks. Quincy pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried, stroking her hair and murmuring soft reassurances. She clung to him like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood, and he vowed silently that he would be her anchor for as long as she needed him to be. From that evening on, something shifted between them. Quincy began visiting Penelope every day after he finished his work on the ranch, bringing her wildflowers he had picked on the range or interesting rocks he had found by the creek. They would sit together in her room or, as she grew braver, on the porch of the main house and talk about everything and nothing. She told him about her life before the fire, about growing up in Illinois and moving west with her parents when she was 15. They had been farmers, trying to make a living from the harsh Montana soil, and while it had been hard work, they had been happy. She spoke of her mother's laugh and her father's steady hands, the way they had all worked together to build something from nothing. And then, in one terrible night, it had all been taken from her, consumed by flames that had started from a knocked-over lantern when her father had gotten up in the middle of the night. Quincy shared his own story in return, telling her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about losing his own father to a Comanche raid when he was just 12 years old. He had fought in the war, riding with the Confederate cavalry, even though his heart had never been in the cause, just trying to survive long enough to see home again. After the war, he had drifted north, working various ranches and never staying in one place for too long. Until now. Until he had pulled a young woman from a burning house and found a reason to put down roots. "You believe in fate?" Penelope asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. It had been nearly a month since the fire, and her burns were healing well, though the scarring was permanent as Martha had predicted. "I do not know," Quincy said honestly. "I never gave it much thought before. Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I wonder if there was a reason you rode past my house that night. If there was a reason you risked your life to save me. Everything else I loved was taken from me, but I was spared. For what purpose, I cannot say, but perhaps it was so I could meet you." Quincy felt his heart skip a beat. And would that be such a terrible fate, meeting a rough cowboy who spends his days covered in dust and his nights in a cramped bunkhouse? She smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the scars. It would not be terrible at all. In fact, I think it might be the best thing that has ever happened to me, even considering the circumstances." He reached over and took her hand, marveling at how small and delicate it felt in his work-roughened palm. "I think I have been falling in love with you, Penelope Rutherford." "Is that too forward of me to say? Too soon after everything you have been through?" "No," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "It is not too soon, because I think I have been falling in love with you too, Quincy Isaacson. You have shown me such kindness, such genuine care. You look at me and you do not see a ruined woman. You see me, the person I am beneath the scars. How could I not love you for that?" He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and kissed her gently. Her lips were soft against his, trembling slightly with emotion, and when they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. It was the first truly happy moment Penelope had experienced since the fire, and Quincy felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she had more moments like this, moments of joy and peace and love. But their happiness was not without its challenges. Word spread quickly through the small community about the scarred woman staying at the Broken Arrow Ranch, and not everyone was as accepting as Quincy and the Garretts. The first time Penelope ventured into town, which was a small settlement called Silver Creek about 10 miles from the ranch, she was met with stares and whispers. Women pulled their children away from her as if her scars were contagious. Men looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. A group of young cowboys outside the saloon made crude comments as she passed, wondering aloud what kind of desperate man would want to bed a woman who looked like she had lost a fight with a grizzly bear. Quincy, who had accompanied her to town, felt rage boil up inside him. He turned to face the cowboys, his hand dropping instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Say that again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I dare you." The cowboys sobered quickly, recognizing the look in Quincy's eyes. They had all heard stories about him, about how he had fought in the war and survived things that would have broken lesser men. One of them held up his hands in a placating gesture. "We did not mean anything by it, Isaacson. Just having a little fun is all." "Having fun at the expense of a lady is not something I tolerate," Quincy said coldly. "And if I hear any of you speak about Miss Rutherford that way again, there will be consequences. Are we clear?" They nodded quickly and retreated into the saloon, leaving Quincy and Penelope alone on the dusty street. She was trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, and Quincy could see tears threatening to spill from her eyes. He gently took her arm and led her to the general store, where they completed their shopping in silence. The storekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, was kinder than most, treating Penelope with the same courtesy she would have shown any other customer. But Quincy could see the damage that had been done, the way Penelope seemed to shrink into herself, trying to make herself smaller and less noticeable. On the ride back to the ranch, she finally spoke. "Perhaps I should not go into town anymore. Perhaps I should just stay at the ranch where people do not have to look at me." "Absolutely not," Quincy said firmly. "You have every right to go wherever you please, Penelope. Those people are small-minded fools who do not matter. What matters is how you see yourself and how the people who love you see you." "But it hurts," she whispered. "It hurts to see the disgust in their eyes, to know that I will never be normal again." He stopped the wagon and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "You are right. You will never be exactly who you were before the fire. But that does not make you less than anyone else. You are strong and brave and beautiful, Penelope. And I promise you, I will spend every day of my life reminding you of that, until you believe it yourself." She leaned against him, seeking comfort in his solid presence, and he wrapped his arms around her. They sat like that for a long time, the Montana wind blowing gently around them, the ranch horses grazing peacefully nearby. Slowly, Penelope felt some of her strength return. Quincy was right. She could not hide away forever. She would face the world, scars and all, and she would do it with her head held high. As summer turned to fall, Penelope and Quincy's relationship deepened. She began helping Martha around the ranch, cooking meals and tending the garden, finding purpose in the daily rhythms of ranch life. Quincy continued his work with the cattle, but every spare moment was spent with Penelope. They would take long walks in the evening, exploring the land around the ranch and talking about their hopes for the future. He taught her to ride, patiently guiding her through the basics until she could handle a horse with confidence. She taught him to appreciate the small beauties of life, pointing out wildflowers and interesting cloud formations, finding joy in simple things. Thomas Garrett watched their courtship with approval, often commenting to Martha that he had never seen Quincy so happy. Martha agreed, pleased to see Penelope coming out of her shell and learning to live again despite her scars. They had both grown fond of the young woman, treating her almost like a daughter. When Quincy asked Thomas for permission to propose to Penelope, Thomas gave his blessing without hesitation. "She is a good woman, Quincy, and you are a good man. I cannot think of two people who deserve happiness more than the two of you." Quincy chose a spot by the creek for his proposal, a place where he and Penelope often came to watch the water flow over smooth stones and listen to the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. It was early October, and the leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and red. He had been working for weeks on a ring, crafting it himself from a silver dollar and a small piece of turquoise he had traded for in town. It was not fancy, but it was made with love, and he hoped that would be enough. Penelope sensed something was different when he led her to the creek that evening. He seemed nervous, his usual confident demeanor replaced with an almost boyish uncertainty. When they reached their favorite spot, he stopped and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Penelope Rutherford, I have never been good with words. I am just a simple cowboy who is better with horses than speeches. But I need you to know that meeting you was the best thing that has ever happened to me. You have brought light into my life in a way I never knew was possible. You have shown me what it means to be brave, to face unimaginable loss and still find reasons to smile. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, every single day." He dropped to one knee, pulling the handmade ring from his pocket. Penelope gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. "Will you marry me?" Quincy asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Will you let me be your husband and your partner and your friend for all the years we have left in this world?" "Yes," Penelope breathed, nodding so vigorously that her hair came loose from its pins. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around as she laughed with pure joy. They kissed beneath the cottonwood trees, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, and in that moment, everything else fell away. The scars did not matter. The tragedy did not matter. All that mattered was this love they had found in the ashes of destruction, this promise of a future together. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Thomas and Martha as their witnesses and a traveling preacher officiating. Penelope wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her sew, with a veil that she could pull down over the scarred side of her face if she wished. But as she walked toward Quincy, who stood waiting for her with such love and pride in his eyes, she pushed the veil back, wanting him to see all of her as she pledged her life to his. There were a few other ranch hands in attendance, men who had come to know and respect both Quincy and Penelope, and they cheered when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Thomas had given them a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property as a wedding present, a cozy two-room structure with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the rolling prairie. Quincy had spent weeks fixing it up, repairing the roof and chinking the walls, building furniture and making it into a home. When he carried Penelope over the threshold on their wedding night, she looked around with wonder at everything he had done. "It is perfect," she whispered, running her fingers over the hand-carved table and chairs. "Absolutely perfect." "Not quite," Quincy said, pulling her close. "Now it is perfect, because now you are here with me." Their first months of marriage were filled with the simple joys of building a life together. Quincy continued working the ranch while Penelope tended their small garden and kept the cabin in order. They would spend their evenings sitting by the fire, Penelope reading aloud from one of the few books they owned while Quincy worked on various projects, or simply watched her with contentment. They made love with a tenderness and passion that surprised them both, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal dedication. Penelope worried at first that her scars would repel Quincy in the intimacy of the bedroom, but he showed her again and again that he meant what he had said that first day in her room. When he looked at her, he saw only beauty. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with bitter cold and deep snow. The ranch work became harder, more dangerous, as they fought to keep the cattle alive and healthy through the brutal conditions. One particularly bad storm in January caught Quincy out on the range, and he did not make it home until well after dark. Penelope had been frantic with worry, pacing the cabin and peering out into the blinding snow every few minutes. When she finally heard his horse approaching, she ran out into the storm without even grabbing her coat, throwing her arms around him as he dismounted. "I thought something terrible had happened to you," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I had lost you too." He held her tight, feeling her shake with cold and fear. "I am sorry I worried you. The storm came up faster than I expected and I got turned around in the snow, but I am here now. I am safe. We both are." She pulled back and looked up at him, snow clinging to her eyelashes. "Promise me you will always come home to me. Promise me I will not lose you the way I lost my parents." "I promise," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I will always find my way back to you, Penelope. Always." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Penelope began to suspect that she might be pregnant. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she felt tired in a way that was different from simple exhaustion. Martha confirmed her suspicions, examining her with experienced hands and declaring that she was indeed expecting a baby, probably due in early autumn. Penelope was overwhelmed with joy and fear in equal measure. She wanted this child desperately, wanted to create a family with Quincy, but she also remembered her own mother's death in the fire and wondered if she would be able to protect her baby where her parents had failed to protect themselves. Quincy was ecstatic when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around despite her protests that he needed to be careful. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Penelope asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we have not been married very long. I know this will change everything." "Happy?" He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands, careful not to press too hard on the scarred tissue. "Penelope, I am beyond happy. I am grateful and blessed and more excited than I have ever been about anything. We are going to have a child together. A little person who is part you and part me. How could I be anything but overjoyed?" She relaxed into his embrace, letting his excitement wash away her fears. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about names and discussing how they would need to add onto the cabin to make room for the baby. Quincy was already mentally designing a cradle he would build, something sturdy and beautiful that could be passed down for generations. The pregnancy was not easy. Penelope struggled with sickness in the early months, barely able to keep food down. Quincy would hold her hair back while she vomited and then carry her back to bed, bringing her weak tea and dry toast. Martha checked on her regularly, bringing herbal remedies and advice. Slowly, the sickness passed, replaced by a growing belly and the first fluttering movements of the baby inside her. The first time Penelope felt the baby kick, she grabbed Quincy's hand and pressed it to her stomach, her face alight with wonder. "Did you feel that?" she asked breathlessly. He nodded, too moved to speak. There was a tiny person growing inside his wife, a child who would call him father. The responsibility of it was almost overwhelming, but so was the love he already felt for this unborn baby. Summer was hot and dry, making Penelope's pregnancy even more uncomfortable. She spent most of her time in the cabin, trying to stay cool, while Quincy worked longer hours to make sure they would have enough money saved for the baby's arrival. He built the cradle he had envisioned, carving delicate patterns into the wood and rubbing it smooth until there were no splinters or rough edges. He also added a small room onto the cabin, working late into the evening by lamplight to get it finished before the baby came. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Penelope brought up something that had been troubling her. "What if our child is frightened of me? What if the baby looks at my scars and cries?" Quincy put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Our child will know you as mother, as the person who loves them most in this world. They will not see your scars as something frightening. They will see them as part of you, part of the woman who gave them life. And as they grow, we will teach them that scars are nothing to be ashamed of, that they tell the story of survival and strength." "You always know the right thing to say," Penelope said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "That is not true. Most of the time I am just stumbling around in the dark, hoping I do not say something foolish. But when it comes to you and our baby, the words come easy, because I mean every single one of them." The baby, a boy they named Peter, arrived on a cool September evening with Martha and another ranch woman acting as midwives. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Quincy feared he might lose both his wife and child. He paced outside the cabin while Martha worked inside, every cry of pain from Penelope cutting through him like a knife. But finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, he heard a new sound, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. Martha opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Quincy. A healthy baby boy, and Penelope came through it well. She is exhausted, but she is going to be fine." He rushed inside to find Penelope propped up on the bed, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in clean cloth. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, both scarred and unscarred cheek wet with them, and held out the baby. "Look at him, Quincy. Look at what we made." He took his son carefully, marveling at how light the baby felt in his arms, how perfect every tiny feature was. Peter had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes, when they briefly opened, were a murky blue that would likely change color in the coming months. His little hands were curled into fists, and his face was scrunched up, as if he were concentrating very hard on the business of being alive. "He is beautiful," Quincy said, his voice thick with emotion. "He is absolutely perfect." Over the next few weeks, they settled into the challenging rhythm of life with a newborn. Peter had strong lungs and was not shy about using them, waking several times each night demanding to be fed. Penelope nursed him while Quincy sat nearby, watching them with an expression of such love and contentment that it made her heart ache. She had worried that her scars would somehow affect how she felt about being a mother, but those fears proved unfounded. When she looked down at Peter nursing at her breast, she felt complete in a way she never had before. This was her family. This was her purpose. As Peter grew, it became clear that he had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn determination. He was a happy baby for the most part, quick to smile and fascinated by everything around him. And just as Quincy had predicted, he showed no fear of Penelope's scars. To him, that was simply what mother looked like. He would reach up with his chubby baby hands and touch the damaged skin on her face, his expression curious but never frightened. Those moments meant everything to Penelope, proof that love truly did transcend physical appearance. The years passed in a blur of work and family and simple happiness. Quincy was promoted to foreman at the Broken Arrow Ranch, a position that came with more responsibility but also better pay. They were able to save money and improve their cabin, adding glass windows and a proper stove. Thomas and Martha became like grandparents to Peter, doting on him and teaching him about ranch life as soon as he was old enough to walk. Penelope continued to face occasional hostility when she went into town, but she learned to ignore the stares and whispers, focusing instead on the people who truly mattered: her husband, her son, and the few good friends they had made. When Peter was 3 years old, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. The little girl had Penelope's delicate features and Quincy's strong will, and from the moment she entered the world, she owned her father's heart completely. Peter was fascinated by his new sister, always wanting to help take care of her and show her his toys. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The ranch prospered under Thomas Garrett's management and Quincy's hard work. Peter grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses and wanted to be a cowboy just like his father. Grace was more reserved, content to sit with her mother and learn about cooking and sewing. But both children were loved fiercely by their parents, raised to be kind and accepting of others, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. One evening when Peter was 7 and Grace was 4, the family was sitting around the dinner table when Peter asked a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. "Mother, how did you get the marks on your face?" Penelope and Quincy exchanged glances. They had known this question would come eventually, but that did not make it any easier to answer. Penelope set down her fork and took a deep breath. "When I was younger, before I met your father, there was a fire at my home. My parents died in that fire, and I was badly burned trying to escape. Your father was the one who saved me. He pulled me out of the burning house and brought me to the ranch where we live now." Peter processed this information, his young face serious. "Did it hurt?" "Yes, very much. And sometimes it still hurts in my heart when I remember losing my parents. But something good came from that terrible night. I met your father, and eventually we fell in love and got married. And then we had you and Grace. So while I would give anything to have my parents back, I cannot regret the path my life has taken, because it led me to all of you." "I think your face is nice," Grace piped up, having been listening quietly. "It makes you special." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes. She reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. That is very kind of you to say." "I think so too," Peter added loyally. "And Father says that scars show you are brave and strong. Is that true?" "Your father is a wise man," Penelope said, smiling at Quincy across the table. "And yes, I suppose that is true. These scars remind me that I survived something very difficult." They remind me to be grateful for every day I have with the people I love. After the children were in bed that night, Quincy found Penelope standing on the porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. "You handled that well," he said. "I know it was not easy to talk about." "It is getting easier," she admitted. "Time does not erase the pain of losing my parents, but it makes it more bearable. And having our children, building this life with you, that gives the tragedy meaning somehow." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. You took something terrible and refused to let it destroy you. You built something beautiful instead. That takes incredible strength, Penelope, more strength than most people have." She turned in his arms to face him. "I could not have done it without you. You were the one who first showed me that I was more than my scars. You were the one who loved me when I could not love myself. Everything good in my life now exists because you saw beauty where I saw only ruin." "I saw the truth," he said simply. "I always have, and I always will." They stood together in the darkness, holding each other and listening to the sounds of the Montana night. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved. The ranch was quiet, the cattle settled for the night, the horses resting in the barn. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of love and mutual respect and unwavering commitment to one another. As the years continued to pass, that foundation only grew stronger. Thomas Garrett eventually retired, selling the ranch to Quincy and making him a full partner. It was a huge responsibility, but Quincy was ready for it, and Penelope stood beside him every step of the way. Together they expanded the operation, buying more land and breeding better cattle. They hired more ranch hands and treated them fairly, creating a reputation for being tough, but just employers. The Isaacson Ranch, as it became known, prospered even as other operations struggled. Peter grew into a capable young man who shared his father's love of ranch work. By the time he was 15, he could rope and brand and break horses with the best of the hands. Grace developed a talent for managing the business side of things, keeping the books and handling correspondence with surprising skill for someone so young. Quincy and Penelope watched their children grow with pride and gratitude, knowing they had raised good people who would carry on their legacy. There were hard times too, of course. A drought in the summer of 1886 killed many of their cattle and forced them to make difficult decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell. A bitter winter the following year tested everyone's endurance, claiming the life of one of their oldest ranch hands and several more head of cattle. And there were the usual challenges of running a business and raising children, the arguments and setbacks and moments of doubt. But through it all, Quincy and Penelope faced each challenge together, their love for each other providing an anchor when everything else seemed uncertain. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Quincy took Penelope back to the creek where he had proposed, a tradition they had maintained over the years. The cottonwood trees were taller now, providing more shade, and the creek had shifted its course slightly, but it was still their special place. They sat on the bank, watching the water flow past, comfortable in the silence that came from years of knowing each other completely. "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked suddenly. "Marrying a cowboy and spending your life on a ranch in the middle of nowhere?" Penelope looked at him with surprise. "Where is this coming from? You know I do not regret anything about our life together. I just wonder sometimes if you would have been happier somewhere else. Somewhere you would not have to face the stares and whispers every time we go to town. Somewhere you could have had an easier life." She reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Quincy Isaacson, you listen to me. I do not care about the stares and whispers. I stopped caring about them years ago. And as for an easier life, what would be the point if I did not have you by my side?" You have given me everything that matters: love, family, purpose, joy. You have shown me every single day since the night you pulled me from that fire that I am worthy of happiness. How could I possibly want anything more than that?" He pulled her close, kissing her with the same passion and tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. "I love you, Penelope Isaacson. I have loved you from the moment I saw you lying in the grass covered in ash and soot, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My hero, my husband, my heart." As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple, they sat together by the creek. Two people who had found each other in the aftermath of tragedy and built something lasting and beautiful. The scars that had once seemed like a curse had become simply part of Penelope's story, no more defining than the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. What mattered was the love they shared, the family they had created, the life they had built together against all odds. Their children grew and eventually started families of their own. Peter married a kind-hearted woman named Sarah who he met at a church social, and they settled on a portion of the ranch that Quincy and Penelope gave them as a wedding present. Grace married a schoolteacher from Silver Creek, a gentle man named James who treated her like a queen. Both couples had children, giving Quincy and Penelope grandchildren to spoil and love. The ranch continued to prosper, growing into one of the most successful operations in Montana. As Quincy and Penelope grew older, they spent more time together and less time working, content to let their children and the ranch hands handle the day-to-day operations. They would sit on the porch of their cabin in the evenings, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Sometimes Penelope would touch the scars on her face, feeling the roughened skin that had become so familiar over the decades. The scars had faded somewhat with time, becoming less angry and red, settling into pale lines and patches that told the story of that terrible night so many years ago. "Do you remember what you said to me the first time you saw my scars?" she asked Quincy one evening, both of them well into their 60s now, their hair gray and their bodies marked by years of hard work and good living. "I said I saw only beauty," Quincy replied, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. "And I meant it then, and I mean it now. You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, Penelope, inside and out." She smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of her eyes. "You are either a liar or the most romantic man who ever lived." "I am neither. I am simply a man who knows the truth when he sees it, and the truth is that you are remarkable. You took a tragedy that would have destroyed most people and you turned it into something meaningful. You built a life, a family, a legacy. And you did it all while carrying scars that remind you every day of what you lost. That is not just beautiful, Penelope. That is extraordinary." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Around them, the ranch was alive with activity. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses whinnying in the corral, children's laughter echoing from Peter and Sarah's house. It was a good sound, the sound of life continuing, of generations growing and thriving. "I am glad you rode past my house that night," Penelope said softly. "I am glad you were brave enough to run into a burning building to save someone you did not even know. If you had not, I would not have this. I would not have you or our children or our grandchildren or any of it." "I am glad too," Quincy said, squeezing her hand. "Saving you was the best thing I ever did. Loving you was the second best thing. And every day since has been a gift I never thought I would have." As the years continued their inexorable march forward, Quincy and Penelope remained devoted to each other, their love a constant in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The wild frontier was slowly being tamed, railroads connecting once isolated communities, telegraph lines bringing news from distant places. Silver Creek grew from a rough settlement into a proper town with schools and churches, and a main street lined with businesses. More people meant more acceptance, ironically, as newer residents arrived who had not known Penelope before her scars, and simply accepted her as she was, a respected rancher's wife and pillar of the community. Penelope became known for her charity work, helping families who fell on hard times and donating generously to the new church. She never forgot what it was like to lose everything, to be dependent on the kindness of strangers, and she made sure to pay that kindness forward whenever possible. Quincy supported her efforts, proud of the woman she had become and the difference she made in people's lives. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren. The cabin they had shared for so many years now expanded and improved, but still fundamentally the same small house where they had started their married life. Thomas and Martha Garrett had both passed away years earlier, but their presence was still felt in the ranch they had helped build, and the opportunities they had given to Quincy and Penelope when they needed it most. On a warm summer evening in 1903, Quincy and Penelope sat together on their porch, watching their great-grandchildren chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. They were both in their late 70s now, their bodies bent with age but their minds still sharp, their love for each other as strong as ever. Quincy's hand, gnarled with arthritis, still sought out Penelope's, and she still leaned into him the way she had done since that first evening in her room at the Garrett's house. "We have had a good life," Penelope said, her voice soft but content. "A very good life." "The best," Quincy agreed. "I would not change a single moment of it. Not even the hard times, the drought and the winter losses and all the struggles, not even those. Because they were part of our story, part of what made us who we are. And who we are together is pretty damn special." She laughed, the sound still bright and clear despite her age. "You are going to curse in front of the great-grandchildren. They have heard worse from their fathers, I am sure. Besides, at my age, I have earned the right to say what I please." They sat together as the sky darkened and the stars emerged one by one, painting the heavens with points of light that had witnessed their entire story from beginning to now. The scars on Penelope's face were barely visible in the dim light, just shadows and texture that had become so familiar they were nearly invisible. But even if they had been as stark and vivid as they were the day after the fire, it would not have mattered. Because Quincy had spoken the truth all those years ago when he looked at a devastated young woman and told her he saw only beauty. He had seen her soul, her strength, her capacity for love and resilience. He had seen the woman she would become, the wife and mother and grandmother who would touch so many lives and create such a lasting legacy. And she had seen in him the kind of man who looked beyond surface appearances, who valued character and courage over conventional beauty, who loved with his whole heart and never wavered in that love. Together, they had taken the ashes of tragedy and built something enduring, something that would continue long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had taught, that love conquers all, that scars tell stories of survival, that true beauty comes from within. The ranch would continue to operate, bearing their name and their values into future generations. As they grew even older, their health began to decline in the way of all mortal creatures. Quincy developed a heart condition that made it hard for him to do much physical activity, while Penelope's joints stiffened with rheumatism, making even simple tasks difficult. But they faced these challenges with the same grace and determination they had shown throughout their lives, helping each other, and never complaining about the inevitable march of time. Quincy passed away first, on a cold February morning in 1905, with Penelope holding his hand and their children gathered around his bedside. His last words were for her, a whispered, "I love you," that she carried with her through the grief that followed. The loss was devastating, like losing a part of herself, and for a time she wondered how she would go on without the man who had been her anchor for nearly 30 years. But she found strength in their children and grandchildren, in the legacy they had built together, in the memories of a love that had sustained her through so much. She lived for another 3 years, spending her days surrounded by family and telling stories about Quincy and their life together. She wanted everyone to know what an extraordinary man he had been, how he had seen past her scars to the person beneath, how he had loved her with a constancy and devotion that was rare and precious. When Penelope finally passed away in the spring of 1908, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, she was laid to rest beside Quincy in the small cemetery near Silver Creek. Their graves were marked with simple headstones that bore their names and dates, but also an inscription that Peter had chosen. He saw only beauty. She taught him love. The ranch continued under the management of their descendants, growing and changing with the times, but never losing the values that Quincy and Penelope had instilled. And though the world moved on, though the Wild West became a thing of legend and memory, the story of a cowboy and a scarred woman who found love in the ashes of tragedy lived on, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of seeing with the heart rather than the eyes. Because in the end, that was what their story had always been about, looking past surface appearances to recognize the true value of another human being, choosing love over fear, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of a shattered life. It was a simple message, but a profound one, and it resonated through the decades that followed, inspiring others to look for the beauty in unexpected places, and to believe in the transformative power of unconditional love. The cabin where they had lived still stood, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, it was almost possible to imagine them still there. Quincy sitting in his chair by the fire, Penelope reading beside him, both of them content in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious. A love that transcended physical appearance, that survived tragedy and hardship, that grew stronger with each passing year. A love that proved, beyond any doubt, that true beauty comes from within, and that the most important scars are not the ones we carry on our faces, but the ones we refuse to let define us. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually inherit the ranch, and they would hear the stories of how it all began, of a fire that took everything and a cowboy who saw only beauty. And they would understand, as each generation before them had understood, that Quincy and Penelope's legacy was not just the land or the cattle or the successful business they had built. Their true legacy was the love they had shared, a love that had started with a simple act of courage on a terrible night and had grown into something eternal, something that would inspire and uplift long after both of them had returned to the dust from which they came. The Montana prairie continued its endless cycle, seasons changing, grass growing, cattle grazing. But in one small corner of that vast landscape, marked by a modest cabin and 2 simple graves, the memory of an extraordinary love remained, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt broken or damaged or unworthy. Because if a scarred woman and a simple cowboy could find such happiness, such fulfillment, such perfect and enduring love, then perhaps there was hope for everyone. Perhaps beauty really was in the eye of the beholder, And perhaps, just perhaps, we are all far more than the sum of our scars.